Kia ora tātou, ko ljames toko ingoa. I'm the Network Sustainability Lead for BusinessNZ Network, and excited to welcome you to part 4 of our All Things Carbon webinar series. Welcome back if you've joined us for 1, 2, 3 or 4 other sessions, and warm welcome to those who are just picking up now. We do have the recorded sessions available if you want to go backwards before you go forwards again. I am pleased to welcome and have Sean Weaver and Kent Barrett from ECOS here today, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. But we designed this series to help cover the end-to-end of carbon measurement and management, so that people could get better educated about this. And we've had a series focusing on measurement, then verification, reduction, and now offsetting. And the next one in the series will be climate positive and science-based targets. Just quickly, as a network, Business New Zealand are standing up our own sustainability program internally. We're on our own journey, and we're also developing a whole program in sustainability for our members and launching products already, because we're really keen to support people on their sustainability journey. And this series forms part of that. We're also, on the carbon front, I have a commitment to be carbon zero by the end of F23 as a network. So we are moving in this space as well. Let me just quickly do a poll before we get into the crux of the session. So each of these series, we've done a sort of warm-up question. If you can just quickly pick which answer resonates most. I realize this is a little bit of a trick question in that you may fit in a couple of categories, but if you just pick the one that your gut says that one, then that would be great. Just wait for a few more responses. Anyone who's just arriving, we're just doing a quick poll. Okay, I'll give you about 5 more seconds. Oh, a few people responding. Okay, I'll just pause there. Great. I'll just show you the results so that it's not a blind question, but you can see that there's actually quite a few on this call who haven't even measured their emissions. So almost half of the people, which is interesting to note, but that's not a worry. It's still really good to understand all these things. And I definitely encourage you, if you haven't attended the other sessions, to listen and incorporate them into your day, so you're learning about the other areas as well. All right, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Sean Weaver, CEO of ECOS, who founded the organisation with carbon at the centre as well, and he's done some amazing work throughout New Zealand and the Pacific in this space, and will be a wealth of knowledge for all the questions you have to ask him when we get to that point in time as well. So welcome, Sean. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and hi there, everybody. I'm just going to bring up a share screen and then I'll talk to that. So let me just get that started, and I'll launch the presentation. Here we go, and up that goes. I'm assuming everybody can see that. Yeah, kia ora koutou. Sean Weaver, taku ingoa. I'm based in Christchurch, CEO and founder of ECOS. We've got offices in Auckland, Wellington, Nelson, and Christchurch, and we work across the carbon markets. And I'll talk to that in a minute. But yeah, this is All Things Carbon webinar, part 4, talking about carbon offsets. So let's have a look at that. So understanding carbon markets and offsetting strategies. And just to introduce ECOS, we, as I said, work across market-based mechanisms for environmental financing. We run a number of programs. One of them is the carbon management program, which is your measure your carbon footprint, reduce your carbon footprint, offset the residual emissions, and then certify the outcome. We have a nature carbon program, which is a supply chain of carbon credits from nature-based solutions projects in New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. We've just started the development of and had our first trade in the Sustainable Development Units program, which is essentially a biodiversity units program. We are a consulting firm and we're structuring nature-based investments. So let's just have a look at what we're going to talk about today. Why carbon offsetting? So I'll take us rapidly through the big picture just so that we set a context for this. Then what is voluntary carbon offsetting, and look at the economics of it, and then look at carbon insetting and the pros and cons between carbon offsetting and carbon insetting. So why voluntary carbon offsetting? So I used to teach at university in environmental science, and it was very compelling to me the challenge that we face with climate change. And this is a graph showing the last 50,000 years of global temperatures, and you'll notice the past is off to the left and the future, the present is at the far right. And the climate variability in the past has been hugely variable. And then about 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, it really settled down and enabled agriculture to become possible. Forcing the climate into a different system state would make agriculture remarkably difficult. We currently have 7.9 billion people in the world, rising at about 2.5 people additional in the world every second, and an extra 80 million people annually. And we can only do that if we've got a good intersection of good soils and good water supply, and climate change threatens that. Voluntary offsetting is very much about getting to a low carbon economy, which requires reducing emissions from carbon sources and also removing emissions by carbon sink. So a carbon source would be, for example, the tailpipe of a motor vehicle. Carbon sink would be, a forest that's taking carbon out of the air. Past CO2 concentrations have fluctuated over the last 500,000 years, but at the current time, you can see we're rapidly rising way out off the scale. Past temperature has gone closely very aligned with past CO2 concentrations because they have an intimate relationship. And the threat, of course, is global warming. And the impacts of global warming are really quite significant. And if somebody like me were to state it accurately in a scientific sense, you'd probably think I was crazy. But the fact is, it's a major problem. That's why we really need to move this agenda forward as quickly as possible. Some of the impacts in New Zealand are going to be the massive impact and cost to our country of extreme weather events. Cyclones just in 1 year alone, 2018, well over $100 million. We are looking down the line of a whole lot of drought, especially eastern New Zealand, and that's going to make it really difficult for agriculturists and our biological economy. We've also got sea level rise that's going to threaten and is threatening our coastal infrastructure. So there's a massive contingent liability to the nation, and the whole nation needs to be assertively participating in this situation. And that's why measuring our carbon footprint, reducing it, and offsetting the balance is very much part of that equation. So what is voluntary carbon offsetting? So it's worth just pausing for a moment and identifying the difference between the two major carbon markets in New Zealand and also globally. So I've got two pictures of rugby. One on the left is rugby union, one on the right is rugby league. And they both look like the same game. But of course, we all know that they're different, but they look the same. So imagine one of them, compliance carbon market. So that's where there's a legal obligation to buy carbon credits. And so there's a limited number of companies in the economy that are required by law to buy carbon credits, but there's no obligation among those entities to actually reduce their emissions. They just have to buy carbon credits. And in fact, that's one of the criticisms of the emissions trading scheme, is that there's no obligation to reduce emissions in the compliance market. But everyone on this call today are in the voluntary carbon market, where the purpose of it, well, where there's no legal requirement to buy. It's typically structured around corporate social responsibility and being part of a voluntary participant in a future low carbon economy, and also where reducing emissions is required in the voluntary carbon market. So it's good to understand that, because people often criticize voluntary offsetting by saying, oh, you don't have to reduce emissions. Well, actually you do. And it's good to be able to communicate that to your stakeholders. Anyway, getting Carbon offsetting is a necessary component of getting to net zero carbon, and the nation is progressing in that direction nowadays. We want to be there by 2050 as a nation. There are many, many organisations and companies that are already net zero now, and there's more and more that are progressing in that direction very rapidly. The way that this works is that you've got each year in your organisation a carbon footprint, which is essentially a volume of carbon emissions that you produce, carbon pollution. The way that net zero carbon works is that you measure your emissions from a range of different sources, and many of you have been to a webinar on that already. You reduce them as much as you can. Some emissions are going to be either impossible to eliminate from your organisation, or they're prohibitively expensive to eliminate. And that's where you go from your original emissions before emission reductions down to your residual emissions after emissions reductions. But you'll notice that the residual emissions are still above zero, because we are not plants. And so as animals, we are always going to be net emitters, or gross emitters of carbon. We're always going to have a carbon pollution impact on the world. And so the only way that we can get to zero typically is when we have a relationship often with plants, and it's about what's happening at the landscape level. So a net carbon emissions position of zero requires balancing out the residual emissions here with carbon offsets here. And if the carbon offsets are equal to the residual emissions, it's a wee bit like, costs and revenue. And if costs and revenue equal each other, then you've got a net zero result. And it's the same with carbon accounting. And so when you balance your residual gross emissions with carbon offsets, you get into a balance. And that's what we're trying to achieve, a balance. Because at the moment, the global economy is way out of balance with way too many emissions. And we need to reverse that. So you get to that balance, and then, of course, you continue reducing your emissions through time, which means that you continue to reduce the volume of carbon offsets that you need to get to zero. And that's the idea. If we want to look at this same thing with an economics lens, you can imagine if you're thinking about marginal cost of abatement, marginal cost of reducing emissions, you've got your low-hanging fruit in the system. And this is why it's so valuable to measure your carbon footprint, because it can allow you to identify the low fruit on your emissions reduction tree. And the lowest fruit are going to be cost negative, where, when you turn the lights off, for example, you have a lower electricity bill, or if you reduce your flights, you're going to have a lower annual cost of say, travel. Then there's going to be higher fruit on the tree that are positive, but they're still cheaper than the carbon price. And it's very sensible to harvest all of those fruit in categories 2 and 3. When you've harvested all of those fruit, you've still got fruit on the tree which are really now quite expensive to eliminate. And either they're above the carbon price, or they're way, way above the carbon price, or they're impossible. It's about managing our relationship between these things. So you start off with your measurement, and you might get a profile of your organization which shows where all of your emissions are. It helps you identify which ones are easy to eliminate and are going to be efficient and effective to eliminate. And so then you reduce, but then you've still got that residual footprint. So that's when you've eliminated carbon emissions in your organization. You've reached a cost threshold above which you just can't go any further. And that's the point of offsetting, is you cause carbon benefits to happen outside your organizational boundary to compensate for those emissions left on the tree. So carbon offsetting is when you essentially buy carbon credits from a third party, where it comes from another organization outside your organizational boundary. Carbon insetting is when you grow your own carbon credit supply. For example, where you plant your own forest and when you own that carbon credit supply. There's another definition for carbon insetting, which is all about investing in further emission reductions inside your organization or your value chain. We regard that as emission reductions because it's captured in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions measurement anyway. And so our definition of carbon insetting is when you grow your own supply of carbon offsets and own that supply. Examples of the type of carbon credits that can be used for either offsetting or insetting: New Zealand units from the emissions trading scheme, verified emission reduction units in the international carbon market, and also verified carbon units from the verified carbon standard. Of course, New Zealand units are sourced from the compliance carbon market in New Zealand, and these other unit types are sourced from the international voluntary carbon market. So you think carbon credits are a wee bit like different currencies, and there are many different types of carbon credit in the world. New Zealand units and the emissions trading scheme is just one among many. Okay, let's have a quick look at the economics of carbon offsetting, because it's helpful to picture this when you're doing strategic planning in an organization. And one instructive metric to think about in this regard is what's happening to the carbon price. So the graph on the left with the blue jaggedy line is the historical carbon price since November 2019 and up until November 2021. And you can see it's on a steady incline, and it's quite a lot higher than that now. Like today's carbon price is $80 on the spot market. And you'll notice that the blue dots are the government price controls. And you'll see that the market price tends to closely align to the government price controls. And the price controls are that blue dots. And you can see they're projected out into the future, 2022 to 2026, the blue dots. And for example, in 2026, the government is anticipating a carbon price control of $110 a tonne. The red dots are Treasury's calculation of the social cost of carbon. And the social cost of carbon is basically the calculating the external cost of carbon emissions per tonne. And you'll see that the government price controls are very similar to the Treasury's estimate of the social cost of carbon. If you're sourcing carbon credits for carbon offsetting from New Zealand, then you've really got the emissions trading scheme to get your credits from. Now, the spot price certainly yesterday was $80 a tonne, and that's for, but the vast majority of carbon credits transacted in the spot market are from exotic forests, exotic plantation forests mostly. Exotic softwoods are pine trees, and exotic hardwoods are things like eucalypts or oaks, alder, and things like leafy trees, basically. And exotic species tend to have quite high growth rates. And that's really handy for a business model for growing them. Native forests are also very popular, but well, they have a whole lot of co-benefits that come with them, like biodiversity and water quality, but they're more expensive to produce, and your pricing for native carbon in the market these days is around $100 a tonne. If we look at the international carbon market for voluntary carbon offsets, of course, I don't want you to interpret this whole table, but it's just to show you that there's a range of different carbon standards on the left around the world that issue carbon credits, and a range of different prices. But if we go to the next piece there and just look at the pricing through to the end of 2021, you'll see that the prices are an order of magnitude cheaper than the New Zealand units, for example. And this is interesting because a lot of these international voluntary carbon prices are way lower than the external cost of carbon emissions. And I'll come to that again in a moment. Carbon offsetting is not just buying a get out of jail free card. It's often criticized as that by people who are not certain that they know quite what they're talking about. Because if you're doing carbon offsetting as part of an emission reduction program, you're measuring your footprint, you're reducing your footprint, and then you're only offsetting those residual emissions that you couldn't reduce in-house because either they were prohibitively expensive or they were impossible. If we all reduced our emissions and then just stopped there and told our customers and our clients and say, hey, we've reduced our emissions, everybody would be happy. There'd be nobody saying that you're getting out of jail free. As soon as you go to offsetting, there's a risk that somebody thinks that you're cheating by buying carbon credits instead of reducing. So it's really important in your communications internally in your organization and externally to make it really clear that this is all about an emission reduction strategy. And by offsetting, you've already measured and reduced, and now you're going the extra distance to voluntarily basically price those residual emissions into your business, right? Then you're internalizing the external cost of those emissions. And that's actually a really important thing to share because it's a voluntary action and it's causing additional good to the world, because when you buy those carbon offsets, you're helping to fund projects that take carbon out of the air. Now, the thing is, if the carbon credits that you buy are those really cheap international credits, then you're essentially saying that, you know, your carbon price might only be $10 a ton. So you think about where that sits on your carbon reduction tree. It's not very high on the tree. And this is where it's really important as a strategic decision to think about, well, what do you believe the social cost of carbon is? What do you believe the cost of your emissions should be set at? Okay, because at the moment there's no regulation telling you that the floor price for carbon credits and voluntary offsetting is any particular number. That may change in the future. I think it probably will change in the future, but at the moment there's no price floor. But low carbon pricing, if you choose to buy low cost carbon credits from the international voluntary market, you'll be locking into your entity and a carbon price essentially that doesn't really incentivize emission reductions, and you'll be exposed to claims of greenwashing. So just that's something to be careful about. If, on the other hand, you price your carbon when you purchase carbon offsets in a manner that's aligned to the social cost of carbon, then what that does is it creates an incentive in your organization to continue to reduce, because you want to reduce exposure to that cost. And you're also being honest about really the social cost of those emissions. And if you lock that price into the organizational financing, you'll help to fast track the decarbonising of the economy. And that equals climate leadership. When the Climate Leaders Coalition contacted me last year for a bit of a catch up, and they said, Sean, you know, in a sentence, what do you regard as leadership? And I said, price your carbon properly. Because if you don't, the whole point of the economic instrument of carbon pricing just doesn't work. So let's have a look at now carbon insetting. Carbon offsetting means you buy carbon credits on the market. You're exposed to future carbon prices wherever they go. You're also exposed to carbon credit supply and competition and associated risks, because carbon credits are not typically sitting in a warehouse waiting for the phone to ring. They're usually all spoken for, and it can be quite difficult to secure a carbon credit supply unless you've got a strong relationship with a project somewhere. If you're buying on the market, then you're less able to control the provenance of your carbon credits. So you might have a particular interest, for example, in native carbon credits, whereas there might be none available in the year that you want to buy them. Carbon offsetting, if that's the strategy, if you're going to lock in offsetting for the duration, you're going to lock in essentially an operating cost into the business, and that'll be relatively low cost in the short term and possibly escalate in the long term as the carbon prices rise. But that might mean a higher price in the long term. Now, this is contrasted with carbon insetting, where you grow your own carbon credit supply. So it's essentially grow your own forest, for example, and then you acquire your carbon credits at cost rather than future market prices. You've also got security of supply because you own and control that supply chain. You control the provenance of your carbon credits because you get to design the project and the co-benefits that it produces. The thing is, though, it's going to be more expensive in the beginning because you've got to spend the money on building that carbon credit factory. In other words, establishing that forest and registering it in, for example, the emissions trading scheme. But it'll be lower cost in the long term, plus you get to own an additional asset. So if you're going to grow your own carbon credits, you could do that on your own land if you already have some spare land, or you could buy some land for the purpose, you could lease some land, or you could partner with an existing landowner. And we work with clients that do all of these things. You know, one particular client has a preference for partnerships with landowners because they didn't want to own land. Other clients said, yeah, actually, we do want to own the land because that way we get to control things a bit more and it's a bit simpler. But of course, in order to buy land, you're going to have a bit of spare cash. It's higher cost in the short term, but lower cost in the long term. So let's have a look at what the cost profile might look like from just an exemplar. And this is the discounted free cash flows for a carbon forest establishment and management program, where it's just all cost, right? Because if you're growing your own carbon credits, you're not selling these credits for revenue. You're just creating your own supply. So it's all cost. And the reason to do this would be financially to think maybe that would be cheaper than buying them on the market forever in the future. So it's just both buying on the market and insetting are both coming at a cost. And it's really comparing those two things to see which one stacks up the best. in a forest establishment exercise, a lot of cost comes at the beginning when you're doing all of the planning, and then you're planting your forest and getting it established. So this is all this these costs, but then your costs in operating are relatively small going forward. So CapEx is the establishment phase, and OpEx is managing your own carbon credit factory. One of the things to understand in a New Zealand setting is that not all carbon forests are equal, and that's because different forest types grow at different rates. And this is a graph showing you the per hectare carbon sequestration rate, which is the rate at which carbon dioxide is taken out of the air and turned into wood by different forest types. And exotic hardwoods, which are your eucalypts, for example, your leafy trees, they are the fastest growing in the New Zealand system. Pine forests are the next one, the blue line, and the slowest in the system are indigenous forests. And that has an impact on your project size and your project costs. So, for example, if you're an entity that has a 30,000 tonne a year of carbon demand, which is, you know, a corporate, for example, and how much land would you need to build your carbon credit factory, you know, to establish your forest? Well, because of those growth rates in the previous slide, it impacts on how big the area you need in order to satisfy your demand for carbon credits. So exotic hardwoods, you know, you need about 1,200 hectares perhaps. If it's native forest, then you're going to need, you know, well over double that. If you're combining exotic hardwoods with natives, then it's a lower number. Pine trees, you know, about 1,500 hectares. So that has a big impact on cost, because of course, if you're having to plant a much bigger area, it's going to cost you a whole lot more money. And that's always the case with native forests compared with exotic forests. And this is one of the reasons why, well, it's the main reason why the carbon credit production industry is heavily dominated by exotic forests. It's because the economics of native forests are very challenging. Project cycle, how does it work? What happens? Well, the initial part of it for a larger project, you develop a business case. And that's going to cost between 10 and 20 grand to deliver. Then the business case will enable you to make a decision to go forward and actually develop the project. And so that project development, which is mostly planning, and it could be land acquisition and these sorts of things, it varies depending on the size of the project, on how much land you need. But, you know, between 100 and 500,000 is, you know, appropriate. And when it comes to implementing the project, which is the actual establishment of the forest itself, well, that's going to vary depending on what forest type it is. But as a rule of thumb, every 100 hectares is going to cost about $1 million to establish your forest. Timing wise, a business case can take a couple of months to deliver, depending on how busy your consultant is. This is sort of services that we provide. Project development, which is all of the planning associated with a project, will take between 6 and 12 months typically. And then project implementation forest establishment will take place over a few years. But you have to place a seedling order for your first planting at least 1 year in advance of first planting. And so, as you can see, this is starting now, you could probably get trees in the ground in 2024 as your first planting year. If they're smaller projects, then of course the prices come down. And we have clients that also have quite small projects because they're not big emitters and they don't have a big appetite for carbon credits. So it's a smaller volume and the prices come down as a result. Here's an example of one of our clients, Meridian Energy, and it's just one site in their collection of projects that we've built for them. This is a site down near Lake Manapōuri, and you've got the blue areas, which are new wetlands that they're creating, and you've got the sort of reddish areas, like this area here, which are going to be, that are already planted in exotic hardwoods. And those exotic hardwoods are, so eucalyptus, various species of eucalyptus, and the blue areas have got native plantings in them. And these eucalyptus are going to be harvested and replaced gradually through time, starting in year 15 and replaced with natives. So longer term, this will all be native forests, but it's just got started using exotic forests because that made the economics work better. That's what the site used to look like. and now it's got a whole lot of trees planted on it. Here's the native planting portion with the community planting, and another Meridian site is on land owned by a Maori community, and that's got a lot of natural regeneration. So natural regeneration can be recruited into a carbon project, but you've got to do some science to determine the age of the vegetation. So you don't have to plant the forest, but you've got to rummage around inside it to prove the age of the forest if you want to register it in the emissions trading scheme. All things carbon series. After this, we've got the last one, climate positive, next Friday. Number 5, offsetting, which is today. And contact Lauren if you want to get in touch with her about anything. And I'll stop the share and we can take questions.
Cool, thank you so much, Sean. I think that really took us under the bonnet of offsetting, so to speak, and I'm sure everyone learned a whole lot more than they bargained for potentially at during your session. So thank you for sharing. Who would like to kick off the questions? So you can either put your hand up, or I can check what's going on in the chat. Just gonna scroll down.
There's a couple in the chat, Lauren, as well. Yeah.
I'm just trying to be the master of my mouse. Someone has asked, so we've got one from Kalinda Rowe saying, is there consideration given to the effects on biodiversity when choosing between exotic pine or native forest planting?
Yeah, very good question. Basically, from a carbon point of view, if you're only talking about carbon, the biodiversity isn't carbon. So the biodiversity is really a co-benefit. And many people like biodiversity. I certainly do. That's why we're in this game. But to create biodiversity co-benefits, you can't get any more carbon credits if there's more biodiversity in the project. But you can sometimes command a premium on the carbon price. If you're a seller of carbon and you've got native forest carbon, you can charge higher prices for that carbon because you typically need to in order to fund the project. But yeah, there is a material disconnect between biodiversity and carbon. Now, some people say, well, what if we were to do lots of pest and weed control, and especially kill lots of possums, for example, and stoats and ferrets and weasels and lions and tigers and bears in our forest? Will that make the forest grow faster if it's a native forest? And unfortunately, what tends to happen in those situations is that the carbon growth rate of the forest doesn't change very much, but the species composition of the forest changes to, if you get rid of the pests, then the forest is made up of a whole lot of delicious tasting species. Whereas if you leave the pests in there, then the foul tasting species have a competitive advantage and off they go. So it's just an aside, I suppose. So next question.
We've got one from Daniel Panjaitan. Sorry if I mispronounced that. How do we measure or get unit of measurement of the amount of carbon credits from trees?
Very good question. In a nutshell, if half the weight of a tree, basically you need to just measure the forest, measure the standing volume of trees in the forest. Half the weight of a living tree is water, approximately. And so if you've got 4 tons of living wood, then from an accounting perspective, you divide that by 2 to get the dry wood. So that 4 tons of wet wood is 2 tons of dry wood. And then the dry wood, approximately half of that dry wood is carbon atoms, and the other half is other atoms, magnesium and phosphorus and nitrogen and all sorts of other stuff. And so your 4 tons of wet wood becomes 2 tons of dry wood, which becomes 1 ton of carbon atoms. But then it's a carbon dioxide story, not a carbon story. And so then you add the 2 oxygens and you multiply that 1 ton by 3.66. So 4 tons of wet wood, 2 tons of dry wood, 1 ton of carbon, 3.66 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's the same all around the world. Like this comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Global Climate Science and blah, 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 blah. So basically the way that these are measured is that you measure the standing volume of wood in the forest. And of course, you have to measure that. If your project is smaller than 100 hectares, in New Zealand, then you don't have to measure. The government will require you just to use a default table for your carbon credit volume. But for larger projects, you always have to measure.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to ask this question from Care Lipiat, and then I'm noting, David, you've got your hand up, so I'll come to you next. I haven't not seen you. So how is the end of life of the carbon credit trees controlled? So the comment is that if they're burnt, it reduces their effectiveness.
Yep.
They think.
Very good question. The first thing to note is that carbon credits are about forests rather than trees themselves. So trees have a limited life, but forests can live for many, many thousands of years. In fact, there's forests on our landscapes now that have been around for 10,000 years and longer. And in the Amazon basin, those forests have been around for millions of years. So think forests rather than trees, because often I've heard in the media people say, oh, that tree's only going to live for 60 years, you know, what about then? No, it's about the forest. And so that's the first thing. Second thing, if there's what's called a reversal, in other words, if your carbon forest then is damaged in some way, then there's two ways of managing that. In the international voluntary carbon market setting, there's a requirement that all projects have to self-insure by only selling approximately 80% of the carbon credits that they produce. And you hold a percentage of carbon, like about 20% of the carbon credits in reserve, where those carbon benefits have been delivered but never transacted. So that if there is a fire, for example, you've got all of these reserve credits to basically make good on any of the reversal. And if it's damaged by fire, then you can't produce any carbon credits again until the forest has recovered from that fire. So the accounting of damage to forest is covered by those kinds of mechanisms. And typically a forest project will take out carbon insurance because of the risk of a fire or a wind damage or something, so that then the insurance premium will then go and buy those carbon credits from another project in order to make good on the damaged part of the project and to cover the cost of re-establishing the forest.
Great, thank you. As promised, just coming to David Benatar now. I think I'll just I think I have to unmute you.
Done.
There you go.
Yep.
We can hear you. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Sean, this is fascinating. You are demystifying something that we all try to understand. And so thank you for that. I still struggle on the international carbon credits pricing versus the New Zealand pricing. That's number one. We can establish principle on how to approach that complexity, but still it's a difficult one to handle and difficult one to justify when we go back to our investment committee or the finance team, and the delta between the two options is so wide, when at the end of the day, it's carbon offset is carbon offset, carbon capture is carbon capture. So, you know, you can build lots of various arguments around it. So we have both international and domestic carbon credits pricing delta. And then we have the pricing delta between mandatory and voluntary. So that's a lot of misalignments, if you say. And can you give us a view on that misalignment, and if there is a place and time where we can hope to see an alignment between voluntary and mandatory and by country? Can you talk to us about that, please?
Yes, David, thank you. It's a very good question. And I think globally, this is one of the big sort of issues in the whole voluntary carbon market is, on the one hand, if carbon offsetting genuinely is about internalizing an external cost, if we're then assuming that the external cost of our emissions is only US $3 per ton, and if that has a huge variation from the actual social cost of those emissions, then we're deeply underpricing our our internalization of that external cost. So that's an issue. New Zealand government is aware of this issue, but because the voluntary carbon market is not regulated in New Zealand, but I think it's likely to be in the future, because MFE are considering its rules on what the future voluntary carbon market will look like in New Zealand. globally, yeah, there is conversation around this as well. One of the interesting things, though, from the supply side and from the integrity of the carbon price, if you've got a big industrial energy project, let's say it's a new hydro dam in India, and you can't justify it unless you can get the carbon financing, because otherwise, or maybe it's a biodiesel instead of fossil diesel to create electricity production for Vanuatu, making the biodiesel out of coconut oil. And if your biodiesel business case can't compete with the fossil diesel, because the fossil diesel is cheaper at a unit price, then the only way to make that project work would be to have the carbon credit revenue to balance the playing field. But in that project, you've still got to demonstrate to the auditors what kind of carbon price do you need in order to actually break even. And if that's only US $3 a ton, well, then it's $3 a ton, because if you charge a higher price, you're just creating a massive windfall, right? So that would be great for the seller, but unfair to the buyer, because the project doesn't actually need that volume of revenue. So that's a kind of an underlying inherent disconnect, because if you overprice your credits, you fail to pass the additionality test, because it wouldn't be financially additional. But the artifact that creates is this huge variation in carbon price. So like, even though the average carbon price, say for the Plan Vivo standard, is like $8 US a ton, you know, that goes from sort of $100 US down to 4 or 5. So there's still expensive projects in there, and they're expensive because they have to charge those prices to break even. A good example would be a project in Indonesia that's got orangutans in it that is displacing what otherwise would be a very profitable oil palm plantation. Yeah, and where the person who owns the concession for the oil palms says, well, yeah, you can buy this concession off me, but you've got to cover my opportunity cost. And so those credits are going to be expensive. So there's a huge variation in pricing on the supply side. And yet we've got this issue of the social cost of carbon to think about as well. And frankly, I don't know how the world will ever resolve that, to be honest. I think it would be a really good subject for an international, I wouldn't say intergovernmental meeting, because an intergovernmental meeting wouldn't have business people at the meeting, but an international, you know, carbon business participants summit on carbon pricing and the social cost of carbon, because yeah, we do have that problem. So one way of getting around that is to keep the carbon price low for those that can't justify a high price, but require buyers to buy more credits to top up the price to get to the social cost of carbon threshold. That's essentially what we do at ECOS. We have a floor price for our customers to say, look, we're not going to let you just buy cheap credits from overseas, because if we do that to you, we're going to expose you to the risk of people branding you as greenwashing, because you're buying cheap credits. And also your cheap credits are not setting a high enough bar as an internal incentive to reduce emissions in your business. And you're underpricing your external cost of your emissions. And so we voluntarily, as a program, we set a floor price. And if the carbon credits come in at a lower price, then we get them to top it up without buying some co-benefits, for example, from another project. So that's the way we do it. But as you know, there's huge variation. And when you add this up over tens of thousands of tons a year, there's a massive difference in that price. And then you've got to justify it internally to your CFO. And they're like, why do we buy this, which is 10 times the price of that, you know? And that's a big issue. So I think ultimately it still comes back to what the business believes is its social cost of carbon, and how committed that business is to being a leader in a low carbon economy. And I believe that businesses that are committed to be leaders in a low carbon economy are going to price their carbon emissions appropriately and source carbon credits that are appropriately aligned with that social cost of carbon price. So Treasury have released a social cost of carbon estimate for between now and 2050, and the 2022 price, the low, medium, and high. So the low price is, I think, $51. The medium is about 77, and the high is 91. And so we get our clients to say, well, you choose which one of those three you want to go with, but you need to choose one of these Treasury numbers. Now, we're one program. Another program might not require their customers to do that because it's a voluntary space. But you've touched on a really very, very interesting point, which I think there's a lot of room for more discussion. And I'm very open to a discussion with you and other stakeholders on this on another occasion, because I think it's really important.
I think something to add there, Sean, as well, from a client-based point of view, you know, the level of understanding in the market, you know, in the general public around responsible carbon pricing and responsible carbon offsetting is just exponentially increasing. So I think that's an important consideration for businesses when choosing their offsetting strategy within their overall reduction and measurement strategy is to consider, you know, how they're going to communicate the decision they've made, and just bear in mind that there is an increasing level of understanding within the market, and it's important to consider that when making your decision.
And in that situation, I think reducing and not offsetting is better than reducing offsetting with really cheap offsets, because with the second one, you're exposed to a public criticism as a greenwash, whereas in the former, you're not. Because if everybody in this audience measured and reduced their emissions and just stopped there, nobody in the public has got any reason to say that you're a crook, even if they're being inaccurate. They've just got no reason to. Whereas if everyone in this meeting measured and reduced and then offset with the cheapest credits they could find and certified with a program that would do that for them, and WeCost is not one of them, but there are others out there that will, your communications risk has suddenly gone way high because of that risk of people saying you're buying get out of jail free cards. And globally, the criticism against that is as Kent said, it's exponentially escalating, and it's quite a sensitive issue for us. Yeah.
The debate around all the tension between cost and value as well, as people quick to just compare based on the numbers rather than what's behind or underpinning the numbers. We've got a bit of a pipeline of questions, so I'll ask the one on my screen and then I'll see if I can clump some ones and themes. So one from Jeff Bennett is, are there any offsets available from regenerative agriculture or from biochar production? And if so, how are they being assessed and measured?
Very good question. Not available in New Zealand, possibly available, certainly available internationally. In the international voluntary carbon market, one of the carbon standards has an agricultural scope. That's the verified carbon standard. And there are projects around the world that are doing regenerative agriculture and a range of different sort of agricultural practices to sequester more carbon into soils. I don't know about biochar. They may be in there as well. I would love to see these kinds of projects happening in New Zealand. They can't happen in the context of the emissions trading scheme because they're outside scope of the emissions trading scheme, but they can happen in the context of the international voluntary carbon market, which actually is much harder to execute a project in the international voluntary market than in the ETS. The ETS, the emissions trading scheme, is a much easier instrument. The voluntary market instruments are much harder and much more costly. So it's only worth considering those other activity types if you're prepared to spend quite a lot of money on proving the concept and commercially and technically first, and then kind of scaling up from there.
Thank you. We've got a question around, or it's asking if you've calculated, but I guess it's is the carbon store subsurface to the trees incorporated in calculations?
Yes.
The comment is that's beyond the tree lifespan.
So subsurface, you mean the below ground carbon?
Yeah.
Yeah, the below ground carbon is included.
Okay, easy answer. So someone's asked, given a newly planted forest takes time to start absorbing a decent amount of carbon, is the carbon offset claimed based on averaging a number of years or calculated each year?
Calculated each year. So in order to offset your carbon emissions, you have to acquire a carbon credit either through growing it yourself or buying it. So that carbon credit represents a benefit to the atmosphere that has already happened, because otherwise it would never be issued as a unit. So it has to be, in a sense, retrospective. And so you buy those carbon credits and then you cancel them in order to consume them. And so in a way, if your appetite for carbon credits is higher than the ability of your forest to deliver on that in the first few years, then you've got two choices in those first few years until the supply curve meets the demand curve. Is you can either buy some credits on the market to meet the shortfall, or you can delay the date when you want to declare a net zero position until your supply curve meets your demand curve. The thing though is that demand curves tend to go sort of flat and downwards like this, whereas the supply curve starts off slow and it goes up and it goes in like this. So the curves are quite differently shaped. And so in those situations, you'll end up with an oversupply of credits for a while and then it'll go under. And so that's where in a project that you're managing yourself, you would bank those credits and then use them when the supply goes beneath the demand curve for certain periods. And depending on how you manage your forest, that might be a regular feature, because if you're doing periodic small scale harvesting to transition a forest from one type to the next, every 5 years you're going to have a bunch of emissions, which drops your supply curve down. I don't want to get into too much detail there, but it's just every year the volume of carbon that's issued is the volume of credits that can be used, and it's a tricky thing to manage. But you can manage any shortfall by buying residual credits on the market, and also by banking credits in years when you've got more supply than demand.
Great, thank you. This next question's around kind of scale and I guess DIY versus investing in a project. So it's from Arani Mahadeva, has talked about drawing a comparison to solar farm versus solar PVs on top of buildings. And the question is, under what scenarios is it worth considering carbon offsets within your own estate rather than investing in a forest? I.e., is there any small scale option?
Yeah, so interesting question. I mean, for carbon offsets exist in the form of carbon credits that are issued in a carbon registry and certified to a carbon standard. And so either you produce those carbon credits inside your own organizational boundary and you call that insetting, or you acquire them from outside your boundary and purchase them. In other words, you pay somebody else to do that, and that's called offsetting. So somebody would just need to make a decision on what their preference is in that regard. And that's a strategic decision. If you're looking at potentially investing, instead of buying offsets, you invest that same amount of money just in further emission reductions, then you've got an interesting challenge there, because if you've already reduced your emissions as much as you can, and all of the marginal cost of your emission reductions, low to medium marginal costs, are already harvested, then any additional spend is going to be at an increasing marginal cost. And so the cost per unit emission reduction is going to just escalate as you go up the marginal cost tree. And so if you want to have the biggest beneficial bang for buck on the atmosphere, it's valuable to consider whether it's better spending that money on causing an emission benefit outside the boundary, where for the same amount of money you could cause 10 times the carbon benefit, because that could be the case with offsetting, or whether you invest that in the company and have a lower material impact on the climate system, but where you lock in a much more efficient system in the long term. It's really a strategic decision for each entity to think about. And as Lauren had mentioned, it's about cost and efficiency and benefit to the company.
Great. All really good questions today. Does anyone want to sneak in maybe one last one before we close? And I guess Sean and Kent, you're welcome to kind of ask a question yourselves. Oh, we've got one more from Arani, who asked that last one. So we'll let you, I think I have to unmute you. Here we go. I'll let you ask it yourself.
I just wanted to ask, is there any so there's going to be countries out there like Singapore who don't have much space land-wise. Are there urban examples of carbon offsetting solutions?
Yeah, I mean, in the international carbon market, carbon credit projects are not just forest projects. They can be energy sector projects. They could be photovoltaic. They could be, wind farms. They could be energy efficiency. They could be capturing methane from a piggery. there's all sorts of different ways to prevent emissions going into the air, and all sorts of ways of taking emissions out of the air. And so the voluntary carbon market has many different sectors. And so there's nothing to stop you having a carbon project in an urban setting in Singapore. And frankly, at the moment, there's probably no thing stopping you doing it in Wellington or Auckland or Christchurch either. But you'd have to register the project in the International Voluntary Carbon Market, because the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme has no mechanism for carbon credit production other than growing new forests. But that's just the current design of the Emissions Trading Scheme. And I've recommended to government in the past, and in the recent past, that we increase the scope of the Emissions Trading Scheme to include energy sector projects. Because if we had energy sector projects in New Zealand, an entrepreneur could set up a business to put photovoltaic on every roof in a town, and use the carbon financing to help the business compete with the background competition in say grid connected electricity, for example. So I think that would be a good thing. And it would also mean that buyers in New Zealand would have a broader spectrum of project types to consider. When you think about the attributes, what do you want to be part of? And if you're an energy company and you want to offset some of your emissions, you might want to offset it in your own neighborhood, in your own sector.
That's right.
By supporting an energy project. So technically, there's no barrier at the moment. Practically, we have to prove concepts first by putting it through the international system. And this is exactly the sort of thing that we do at ECOS, is we prove concepts by getting those first projects over the line and be the first clown that charges through the brick wall and gets all the bruises. But you got to have that if you want market development.
Great, thank you. I'm going to sum up, I guess, my key takeout, which would be, I think, probably the T-shirt Sean would be wearing every day if he could, if I may say so, which is about the key message being price emissions appropriately and then source in alignment with that. Do either you, Sean or Kent, want to add anything in the form of a closing argument?
I mean, the only thing I'd like to add is to thank everybody for coming along to this, and also to thank Business New Zealand for setting this up. And this is a fantastic initiative to help create a dialogue in the business community to help people get a clear line of sight, understand what's coming, and make appropriate decisions as they go forward. So fantastic work, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. And if anybody wants to get in touch afterwards, feel free to contact Kent or myself. Best if you contact Kent, because my emails are pretty full, and Kent will probably say, Sean, why'd you do that for? But anyway, feel free to get in touch. We're happy to help.
Yeah.
And also happy to put you on to other friends in the sector. I mean, Toitu and Vairaki provide fantastic services in this regard. Think Step, many others are doing really good things. So we're certainly not saying come only to us, because in fact, we need cooperation in the sector. If we're going to actually fix climate change, we're going to have to work together as much as we can.
And I think my final comment would just be, and it kind of links up with the sessions that have already been before this one, is to look at all of these different aspects within your carbon management strategy. So, the importance of measurement, the importance of reduction, and the importance of offsetting. I think it's quite easy with organizations I work with on a daily basis to kind of get tunnel vision on one aspect of that strategy, or want to run straight to climate positive or net zero before they've even completed their first measurement. And so I think it's just really important to kind of look at it as a linked strategy that might have a net zero outcome in a number of years' time, but there's these other key components to be done first. So I think looking at it as a holistic strategy is a really good place to start. And I think that really you benefit from that in the long run as well. Once you reach that goal, maybe that's a net zero, maybe that's a climate positive, which we'll discuss more on Friday. If you look at it as a connected strategy and treat it as such, you benefit when you get to that communications point of view and that sharing point of view of how you've done this, because you've done it well. So I think that would be my kind of parting comment.
Great, thank you very much, Kent. And as Kent mentioned, the next and final part of the series is focusing on climate positive and science-based targets a week from now, and we are keen to have your thoughts. It's a panel bringing it home with the whole series. And as Sean mentioned, this series is a collaboration between ECOS, ThinkStep, Toitu and Dita, representing the collaboration of consultancies and the impact focus and the intent in which they operate, and also the way in which you deliver as well. So you'll be able to hear a balance of views, some contradictory, some in alignment, but really kind of get all the juices flowing around that topic. But we're keen to hear your thoughts on what you want particularly out of that session. So feel free to reach out to me on via my email, which is L for Lauren James, ljames@businessnz.org.nz, and you're welcome to plant some questions for us for that session. Other than that, just a huge thank you to both Sean and Kent for being present today, and importantly for the knowledge and wisdom you've imparted. There's been a huge amount I've personally taken out of this, and I can see your large fan club reflected in the comments, all saying thank you, and that it's been very informative and learned a lot. So thanks everyone for coming. Look forward to seeing you at the last session. And again, if you want to go backwards before forwards and you're just joining us for the first time today, you can access the other sessions via our website, and I will be sending out a recording via email as well. So thanks again. Have a wonderful afternoon and weekend. Ka kite anō.
Ka kite.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. See ya.